So when it comes to visuals and game projects, oftentimes the difference between a work in progress and a finished product is in how lighting and other post-processing effects are applied to the raw images on screen. You might have seen games that are visually nothing more than primary shapes, and they still manage to look really cool and impressive. The art is not necessarily anything to write home about, but in combination with the right colors, proper lighting, shaders, and animation, the end result becomes interesting and visually appealing. So that's what we're going to be doing in today's video. We're going to be leveraging Godot's 2D lighting effects so that you can create light sources that cut through darkness, design atmospheric scenes using colored lighting, create immersion by generating real-time shadows from objects, and wrap all of these effects together to create something that's hopefully more pleasing and interesting to look at. And so let's get to it. Again, I'll use my game as an example to provide practical suggestions on how to fuse lights into your 2D graphics without turning your levels into a carnival scene. I'm assuming you have some graphics files that you can use in the scene to test out Godot's lighting effects. Now, if you don't, you can also use a white square to build up rudimentary platforms, walls, and even backgrounds. Just save a square graphics file and import it into your project's asset folder. If you want to go crazy, you can also create complementary shapes like circles, triangles, and the like. For everyone else, I'm assuming you have either tilesets or independent graphics files. Once you have a working scene ready, we can start working around with the lighting effects. It's time to bring in the Canvas Modulator node. Think of this guy as a very thin, translucent strip of colored film that's layered over your entire scene. Canvas Modulate works via multiplicative blending, meaning it doesn't paint over your sprites, but rather it multiplies affected color information on layers below with darker shade. If you really want to get into the math, this is how I understand it. First of all, game engines and programs often normalize color channels into floating point numbers. Now that we're using the Canvas Modulate node, what happens is we have to choose a color for it, and that color represents a value between 0.0 and 1. That chosen value is the fraction that is now multiplied against another fraction that represents the color value that's rendered beneath the Canvas Modulate node. Because you are multiplying two fractions that are usually less than 1.0, the mathematical result is always equal to or smaller than the original values. Now in color terms, when the numbers grow smaller, the color gets darker. Similarly, if you try to multiply pure white, which has the value of 1, nothing really happens. Make the canvas completely black though, and be honest, for a moment there you thought something went seriously wrong, right? Like I done messed up or something. I'm just messing around with you guys to see who fell asleep during my analysis on the finer points of the multiplier filter. If I'm going to be completely honest, I didn't have any idea how the multiply filter actually works until I made this video. Just like everybody else, I had to Google that information and then I kind of posted it here as if I knew what the hell I was talking about. Multiply makes shit darker. That's how it works. Maybe I should have just left it at that. All right, let's keep going with this. The Canvas Modulate node works in other aspects as well. It doesn't have to just create dark spaces. You can also create dark evening skies or simulate the colors of a setting sun as an example. Remember though, Canvas Modulate node renders this color over everything with the exception of parallax layers and the HUD elements, as you can see in my asteroid level. However, I have now learned that this isn't actually true when it comes to the new improved parallax 2D nodes. What can I say? Godot's a bit of a moving target when you're stuck in one version. I'm using 4.4. You're probably going to be using 4.7. And for anyone who potentially sees this video years later, you're going to be using something super awesome. So for now though, and probably in the future, the new Parallax 2D nodes will be affected by the Canvas Modulate node. Now for the instances where you want to separate the Parallax 2D nodes from Canvas Modulate effects, perhaps with the intent of creating a visual style similar to what's being used here in Donkey Kong Country Returns Tropical Freeze on the Nintendo Switch. You can still do this by wrapping your Parallax 2D nodes with a Canvas Layer node. And to make sure that your Parallax 2D graphics don't get mixed up with the foreground elements, use the Canvas Layer node's Layer option to push the visuals way into the background. Everything else is guaranteed to be affected by the Canvas Modulate node. With this in mind, there's going to be elements that you would rather not shade with Canvas Modulate, like fire, sparks, explosions, laser beams, bright particles, and the like. It wouldn't hurt to plan ahead and convert visuals that emanate light into unshaded assets. And since I'm such a nice guy, I'm going to show you really quickly how to do it. First, click on the graphics file you want to be unaffected by darkness, i.e. the Canvas Modulate node. Check out the inspector on the right, then scroll down to the section named Canvas Item, and under Material, choose New Canvas Item Material. Then, click on the Canvas Item Material to reveal further options. Click on the Light Mode drop-down menu to reveal the options and choose Unshaded. You can also consider checking out Blend Mode just above Light Mode. Bright energy and textures could very well use Additive as the blending mode. As an example, I use it in my bullets and sparks to make the visuals a bit brighter. Okay, that takes care of the first node. We still have 2 to go. So ladies and gentlemen, buckle up and let's get ready for Point Light 2D. Next, what you want to do is use light sources to burn away the darkness. And so add a Point Light 2D node into your scene. This node doesn't do anything on its own, but if you look at the inspector on the right again, you'll see that there's a slot reserved for textures. These textures carve through the dark film of a Canvas Modulate node and act as a light source. Clicking on it allows for a multitude of options, and you can use Godot's own placeholder textures and in-engine generated gradients if you don't have your own images. Now, having said that though, I greatly prefer using self-made textures for lighting up specific sections in my level. Another cool thing about the Point Light 2D node is that while Canvas Modulate darkens the entire screen, you have way more control over which objects are affected by Point Light 2D nodes. This is both useful and important. It makes sense to use background-specific lights without having to worry about the light bleeding over your foreground objects and vice versa. This helps players separate interactive foreground objects from decorative background elements. There's quite a bit you can do with lights and setting a desired mood for your level or scenes, whether that's casting a reddish glow to warn players of an impending danger or directing movement with inviting or calming light sources. We aren't even talking about animating light sources to create interesting storytelling sections and surprises yet, but those are all things you can easily do with Godot. Point lights can also cast shadows as long as you set them to do so from the inspector. There's some choices available as to how smoothly edges of the shadows are rendered, but it's good to keep in mind that casting shadows can become quite taxing hardware-wise. Real-time shadows do look nice and can contribute significantly to the overall mood in a scene, but I don't think it necessarily makes games look automatically better. You should always have a clear understanding of why you choose to make a use of any feature or function. Sure, experiment away and play around with Godot, but more than often, less is actually more. It could just be that using real-time shadows makes sense only in certain situations, while others it has a greater tendency to create confusion in busy scenes. Do what serves your ideas and intentions the best. 2 nodes down, 1 to go. And the interesting thing is that we now have darkness, we have light, but we still don't have shadows. Can't really have shadows until we add the Light Occluder 2D node into the scene. So let's do that right now. Alright, to use occluders in your scene, just add one from the menu on the top left corner of the screen. In the pop-up window, search for Light Occluder 2D and it should appear into the search screen without much of a hassle. Double-clicking on the node adds it to the level hierarchy. Locate the node. You can use search if you really need to, and then click on the node itself to see a lot of options appear on the inspector on the right. Beneath the Light Occluder 2D section title, you can see immediately the Occluder drop-down menu, which is empty. Click on it and choose New Occluder Polygon 2D. It's a mouthful to be sure. Now click on the selection to open up additional options under the Light Occluder section. Right now, we're interested in adding polygons that define the light blocking occluder. So click on the Packed Vector 2 array. An Add Element button should have appeared just below you. Click on that and start clicking away to add the polygons that actually create the occluder that we want to use to cast shadows. You want to make sure that the Godot editor is an actual select mode instead of move or rotate. These other modes will not add vector points needed to make the occluder shaped. So check out over here and make sure you got the arrow highlighted. That means the select mode is engaged. Go ahead and start placing occluders on walls and other objects that are blocking light, but make sure not to go overboard with complex polygonal shapes. Every added polygon adds to the math and it makes your processor work that much harder. And depending on the type of shadows you choose to use, generating real-time shadows can get really heavy real fast. Now the really cool thing here is that not all point lights need to cast shadows, even if the light source touches the light occluder. I know it's not the most realistic thing to do, but you can choose to limit interactions with lights to specific layers and avoid running too many rendering checks with complex environments. There's also different kinds of occluder types for specific kinds of circumstances. I'm using the basic closed polygonal loop that traces my level geometry somewhat faithfully, but I've chosen so far not to use it in my asteroid level. A lot of the shapes of this level are round, organic, and irregular. I couldn't get the shadows looking nice against the asteroids, and since my parallax layers are stacked beneath the canvas layer node, the point light 2D lighting doesn't show up against the background anyway. I feel like the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze in this instance, and so I'll just leave the real-time shadows out for now. Another thing to consider is how you build your level scenes. I tend to populate my levels with self-contained scenes that don't require additional fidgeting in the level scene itself. This includes sometimes the light occluder 2D. Then again, if your levels are smaller, you can totally get away with drawing the light occluder into the level scene itself and skip adding it to your walls and any other separate object scene you're using in your level. That's something to consider, especially if you're having tons of objects in your level intersecting one another. Light occluders can be placed on tile sets too, but I've always had issues in getting them to work properly. Time and time again, I get these tiny gaps between the tiles that completely mess up the shadow rendering when I play the level. I'm sure you can make it work, but I didn't bother doing so now. Instead, I just added the occluder to my level scene on top of the tiles, and that did the trick for me. Oh yeah, one more thing about light occluders and related features. So this is going to be insanely cool, but as I was editing this video, I discovered these sign distance fields. I'm not going to talk too much about them in this video because it's a technique that uses shaders to achieve soft rendering shadows really inexpensively, along with a host of other really cool effects. Stuff like global ambient occlusion, GPU accelerated weather and particle collisions, stuff that sounds really cool. It's just that I can't stuff everything into this video, and I would rather experiment the tech a little more before talking about it. I would rather show what I managed to do with the tech in my own project, and since it would take me a lot of time to implement these features to my game, I'm just gonna have to leave it for now and circle back to it at some later date. I just wanted to let you guys know that there's this really cool looking stuff that's doing really impressive things with Godot. And so if you want to take a look at it yourself, these are called sign distance fields, and they'll help you out with these soft shadows and all these other really expensive techniques, but do it in a way that's not very expensive at all for the hardware. Now that we've got the basics down in handling lighting in Godot, I want to talk a little about how I've done my graphics and how I've spruced up some of my lighting effects I use in my level environments. First of all, I use these relatively large textures in my asteroid level to frame the environment. These textures have three parts to them. There's the foundation, which is the texture itself without any strong lighting used for the edges or the center. Then there's the shading, which lies on top of the foundation and the z-axis. This allows me to control the depth of the shading by changing the opacity of the shade from the inspector. Last but certainly not least, I have a glow texture covering most of the asteroid texture edges. Mind you, this texture isn't visible until a very bright source of light touches it. I'm controlling this effect with a shader and by setting the texture on a completely different light layer. The shader checks if the intersecting light sources are strong enough for the glow to become visible, while the layering allows me to control what kind of light sources light up the glow. At this time it's bullets and other similar high energy objects. This looks really sweet in my opinion. I've reproduced the same effect with a tile set that I created years back for a completely different project. I don't have a shade component ready for the tile set itself, but I could do one if I really wanted to. Alas, the tiles were drawn for a full HD resolution screen, and that means that each tile is 64 by 64 pixels large. And for that reason, they kind of look really big when used in a 640 by 360 resolution screen. Still, I created this test level with the light, shadows, and specific flashlight features that the player can control with a controller. I also went as far as reworking my camera script for extra mobility and some other level-specific controls. If I choose to make this level later on, I'll show some of the shaders and scene ideas that I came up with that could potentially create really cool puzzle-like elements to the game. We'll see what comes of that, but I really got excited about this and about using light sources as something to scan objects and burn this weird muck off objects to make them operable. In the future, I'm thinking about having enemies that need to be cleansed from this muck for the ship's weapons to be able to harm them. Yeah, I wonder where I might have gotten that idea from. Looking cute in a human suit. Whatever. I'm still gonna do it. Alright, that was a lot of information to process, so let's just recap what we've talked about and then you can go and open up Godot and try these things for yourself. Canvas Modulate. Layer that acts as darkness. Covers most elements with its color except the children of a canvas layer node. can be tinted for effect, such as a nighttime sky or a setting sun, or etc. etc. Point light 2D, used as a light to burn through the color of the Canvas Modulate node. Requires a texture, image, or Godot generated gradient to function. You can determine which objects can receive light from any which point light 2D node via the item called mask and by setting a light layer for the object that is affected by the point light 2D node. Point light 2D generate light sources can generate shadows but require light occluder 2D nodes to function. Light occluder 2D blocks point light 2D or directional light generated light sources. Allows shadows to be rendered from a point light 2D light source. Casts shadows only if the occluder and the light source share the same light mask. Alright, that's it. These are the 3 basic nodes you use to create lighting effects in Godot, but there's obviously so much more you can do. I built a lighting effect using 2D textures and a bit of shader coding. While I'm sure others have used similar techniques in their projects, it still feels great to come up with your own personal designs for effect or function, and then being able to see it running in real time. It just feels great, man. With that said though, I hope this video has helped you out. I hope you find your own ideas and use them to build awesome experiences for others to enjoy. I, however, need to get back to my game project. I have a boss to make, and coding that old bastard is going to take a lot of work. I'll let you know how that went though, as soon as I'm done with it. Have a great one, folks, and I hope to see you in my next video. Adios.
Let's go. We ain't slowing down, baby, come and show me how. Gotta do it right now, you know you gotta hold me down. Can I let